Hey, I'm Cody Leibold, and today I'm going to be talking with Jacob Brutton about social justice and scripture, as well as presuppositionalism, and we're going to do a Q&A. And this is going to go for about 30 minutes. So if you'd like to ask questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and let me bring Jacob Brutton on right now. So Jacob, tell us a little bit about what is on your mind this week as far as these topics. They're kind of all over the map, but they are related.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about trying to post a little bit more about presuppositionalism recently myself, and then I saw you kind of go on a tear on Facebook, so I've appreciated that, and I'm excited to jump in on that and kind of get in on it. I'm sure that a number of people saw my recent post this morning, kind of tying presuppositionalism and reformed epistemology to this whole social justice phenomenon. So I think that's something that will be really good to get into, and I really hope that people will ask us questions about the connections and maybe even raise objections and challenges to our claims about that, because I think that's a really good and important topic to discuss. But there's also just the general confusion that still needs to be untangled around the topic of social justice, how it relates to economics, how it relates to race. I mean, we've covered a lot, but there's still a lot of confusion out there, and there's still a lot of things that we can kind of help people unravel that I'm hoping to be able to do here. One of the major things that I wanted to kind of point out is that what we see with social justice a lot from the cultural left and now increasingly from within the church is the phenomenon of unwarranted accusations, of people jumping to unwarranted conclusions. And you see this, with Ray Ortland saying, white pastors don't be afraid to preach the truth, even if you get kicked out of your church for doing it. And the implication is, of course, that the evangelical churches are full of a whole bunch of white supremacists who are going to fire their pastor for condemning racism. Or you have, Russell Moore claiming that you can't worship Jesus Christ and Jim Crow, or you can't serve Jesus Christ and Jim Crow. And the implication, of course, is that there's a whole bunch of evangelicals throughout America who want to worship Jim Crow. And so you've got these unwarranted accusations, and often along with them unwarranted conclusions. And whenever they're objected to, they're happy to use reason and to dialogue in order to stave off objections, but they don't ever want to use reason or arguments or dialogue in order to justify their accusations or the conclusions. And we kind of see a parallel of that in the culture right now in politics with the whole Brett Kavanaugh phenomenon, with the accusations that have been leveled against him. Now, we don't know whether the accusations are true or false, and that's not my point. My point is we've been given no evidence to believe that they're true. And the way that everybody, especially on the cultural left, is reacting to these accusations is to assume automatically that they're true without any warrant, without any justification, and then to utilize arguments and objections and things like that to stave off those people who want to ask, well, is it even true? This whole phenomenon of lobbing out accusations and jumping to conclusions in an unwarranted fashion, and then only using reason to stave off external objections, not to question whether or not it's true in the first place, but to confuse other people enough to say, hey, you shouldn't be looking into this, you shouldn't be investigating this, is very, very similar, I think, to what presuppositionalism and reformed epistemology teach Christians to do in regard to the Christian worldview in general. And that is, it's okay to assume, and sometimes they would even say it's necessary to assume or presuppose the Christian worldview without any reasons to rest it upon in your own thinking. And then you do utilize reasons, you do engage in argument and debate, but only to stave off those atheists who want to object to the Christian worldview, not in order to establish the truthfulness of the original claims. So I think that's a really common denominator, and I think there are other common denominators where we can trace causal relations, but I think that's one that I'd like to throw out there and draw people's attention to.
I want to remind you that this is a Q&A, and go ahead and drop a message in the comments if you would like us to address something. We'll be tracking it as much as we can. We're trying to set the context right now, so hopefully this is triggering some ideas as far as what kind of questions you'd want to ask.
Yeah, do we have any questions yet? If not, then let's see. Sorry, I turned on your video on Facebook Live to track the comments, and it was echoing in my ear.
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions yet.
Okay, great. We do have some questions because for those of you who don't know, we do a patron hangout once a month, and we are currently doing our patron hangout, which has some questions in it. So I think we'll go ahead and interact with some of the questions that our patrons have asked, and then as we get Facebook Live questions, we'll address those as well. So Matt Travis, some of you guys might know him. I think he does the Matt Travis blog on Twitter. I think that's the right handle. And then we also have Gregory Muse, or GS Muse, I think is his handle on Twitter. You guys might be familiar with those guys if you follow us. Those guys are part of our patron hangout, and they brought up some issues that we'll kind of discuss here while we're waiting for questions to roll in. One of them that Matt brought up was the issue of whether or not we're responsible for what we believe. And I think this is a really important topic, as Matt, I think, pointed out in our sort of pre-show discussion. A lot of people who address the topic of social justice, or just other topics in the church in general, don't seem to treat ideas with the gravity and the seriousness that I think that they need to. It matters whether or not we're right about the definition of justice, and consequently about the definition of social justice, or justice applied to the social context on a wider scale. It matters, you know, that one side's right and another side is wrong. And maybe both sides are wrong. I think that's doubtful, because I think that they're sort of polar opposites. But maybe both sides are wrong, in which case it matters that both sides are wrong, and we need to figure out what is right, what the third correct alternative is. The point is, it matters, and we can't just stick our heads in the sand as if this doesn't matter. We also can't stick our finger in the wind to figure out, well, what's the safest bet, right? We don't want to do a sort of Pascal's wager on this and say, well, you know, the safest bet is to go along with the leading Christian intellectuals because they most likely know what they're talking about. Or, you know, the majority seems to be going in this direction, so that's the safest bet. Let's just go ahead and hedge our bets and go with the majority here, because then you're sacrificing truth and potentially true justice and true goodness for the sake of your own safety, whether it's your psychological safety in terms of saving face with your friends, whether it's social safety in terms of being able to say that you couldn't help it. You know, a lot of this is based in fear. A lot of this is based in the fear that I don't know what's true. I'm not sure how to figure it out. And maybe if I just go with a majority, then I'll have the excuse that, you know, I was just doing what everybody else was doing. I couldn't help it. It wasn't my fault. The problem is, you're going to be held accountable for the ideas that you yourself hold, and especially for the ideas that you propagate. And if you don't think that you propagate ideas in this day and age, if you're on social media, every like, every share, every comment, every tweet, all of those things are ways that you are either endorsing or condemning, whether implicitly or explicitly, the ideas that you're interacting with. So you don't get a free pass on this, and you're going to stand before God as an individual. You know, they always say the line before the judgment seat is single file. You won't get to hide behind Russell Moore. You won't get to hide behind your favorite popular Christian leaders and say, well, so-and-so said it was true, therefore I thought it was too. That's not a valid excuse. You won't get to hide behind the fact that the majority of Christians agreed on the issue. Just like Catholics won't get to hide behind the fact that the Pope said it was right. Just like Mormons won't get to hide behind the fact that Joseph Smith said it was so. Truth matters, and what you believe as an individual matters on these issues especially. So you've got to figure it out, and there's no substitute for trying to figure it out. And by the way, that's another way that presuppositionalism and Reformed epistemology and other forms of fideism play into this. That other forms of epistemology, apart from the classical Christian approach to epistemology, encourage the mindset that you aren't responsible for the ideas that you hold, that it's okay to go along to get along, to go along with the crowd, that you don't have a personal responsibility to figure it out for yourself, or that there isn't a way for you to individually figure it out for yourself. But that's just not true. That's not what the Bible teaches, and it's a very unsafe point of view to take from the point of view of eternity.
All right, Jacob, I found there's a lot of questions popping up now. So let me read to you some questions, and then we'll just take them one by one. So this is from Jeff. He says, social justice conversations seem to always go back to slavery in the Old Testament, Exodus 21, for instance. How do you address that one?
Well, if you could look up Exodus 21 for me real fast and maybe kind of get the gist of what the reference is there. Sure. It's right that social justice issues do end up going back to slavery quite a bit. I'm not sure what that passage has to do with slavery, but we'll find out. But I don't think it's just slavery. It goes to the issue of racism in general, especially in church circles, because I think less people in the church are as confused about the economic aspects of social justice than they are about the racial aspects of social justice. And so it's a little bit easier. It's a little bit more obvious to most people that racism is evil than it is that, for instance, capitalism is evil, right? And the social justice crowd wants to denounce capitalism just like it wants to denounce racism, at least when we're talking about cultural social justice. So when it gets brought into the church, most Christians are more prone to join in with the aspect that condemns racism than are prone to join in with the aspect that condemns capitalism, although I think that's growing as well. So I think that's probably why that's the emphasis in Christian circles, because more Christians are heartily in agreement that racism is bad, and social justice sort of angles itself as the way to fight racism, which I think is potentially a confusion. But go ahead. Do you have Exodus 21 there so that we can figure out what the tie is?
Sure. Yeah, I just reviewed the passage, and I don't know what Jeff has in mind as far as the connection there. It does talk about provisions for slavery, but we do know that slavery is not the same thing as man stealing, and that man stealing received the death penalty in the Old Testament. So the kind of chattel slavery that we had in the Americas in the last several hundred years is not the same as what's being described in this chapter, Exodus 21. I'd have to have more information to know what his connection there is. Okay. All I would say is that this is not the easiest topic for Christians to explain. It's a harsh chapter, and we acknowledge that.
Yeah, if Jeff's asking that as a sort of objection to Christianity and say, basically implying, hey, look, the Bible condones slavery, I think that's a potentially substantial objection that Christians have to wrestle with. And I just say that that's not really the topic that we're wanting to address right here. We're kind of talking about within the church, although I'd be happy to interact with Jeff on that outside of this. The one thing I would say is I don't think that passage is teaching that God condones slavery. I think it was likely an issue of that was the cultural norm, and he was giving prescriptions for how best to deal with the cultural norm at the time. But that's the best answer I can give at this moment.
Yeah, one other thing to add there is that the conditions of life in the wilderness in a tribal society where there was war and then more war and then wild beasts, if you had conquered somebody and you did not take their the remaining survivors as servants of some kind, what were the alternatives? It's just something to think about. So, all right, let's go on to the next question. Paul Calvert, conservatives are often bad at dealing with problems such as people who do actually need help to keep them from dying. The social justice approach is generally used to justify theft-funded social programs to address these real issues. But there are other options that don't involve theft. Please discuss these alternative options.
Yeah, so the most obvious alternative is charity, right? So and there's a couple different angles to this argument. One issue is um, at least those who are within the church who advocate social justice, they don't want, or at least they claim that they don't want, government enforced justice on these issues. So, for instance, someone like Tim Keller or Joe Carter would say, yes, that's an issue of justice, caring for the poor who can't care for themselves, that they aren't able to get the medical care that they need, or whatever the case is, and it's an issue of justice that we care for them. But we don't want the government to step in and force us to care for them the way that maybe those in the culture who call for social justice would. And so they think that that's a significant enough differentiation between themselves and those in the culture who call for social justice. And while I'll grant to them that is a good and significant differentiation, I don't think it goes far enough because I don't think that a biblical worldview counts that as justice. Unless what you mean is universal justice in the sense of righteousness, which means just doing your moral duty in general. But I don't think that's the way that these people are using the concept of justice, and I can answer why I don't think that's the case here. I think what they mean is you owe it to them. Even if the government shouldn't get involved, you still owe it to the needy. And I think there's a bigger problem with that, and that is that the Bible doesn't teach that we owe it to the needy. The Bible doesn't teach that needs constitute a right or a claim against those who are able to alleviate the need. It does teach that we ought to help those in need, but that the help that we give isn't deserved. It's a gift. And it's a really crucial distinction to make. So for instance, there's a really awesome couple, Michael Chardavain, I think I'm saying his name right. Michael and Sarah Chardavain. If you don't know of them, I shared their video on my Facebook page yesterday, so please go to my Facebook page and look. They're a really amazing young couple. They're about my age. Shortly after they got married, she got Lyme disease. He ended up contracting Lyme disease as well. They've gone through a lot of horrible struggles because of their illnesses. They don't have insurance. They can't afford to pay for all this. They've started a GoFundMe. And I was blessed to donate to them, and I plan on being blessed by donating to them over and over again in the future as I'm able to. But the point is, I'm doing it as a gift, and the blessing is in the fact that it is a gift. Are we still connected, Cody? I just saw a notification on my phone that made it seem like I got disconnected. Are we still connected?
Yeah, it looks like we're just fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I didn't give it to them because they deserved it. They didn't do anything to deserve it, and that's part of the goodness of it is in giving the gift, I'm demonstrating the grace of God in the gospel. I'm demonstrating that grace goes above and beyond what is owed or what is deserved, and it cares for people's needs out of a sense of compassion rather than out of a sense of duty. Rather than out of a sense of justice, which is what these social justice warriors in the church want to claim. And so when my argument here is basically when we claim that giving to the needy is an act of justice, we nullify grace and we nullify the whole idea of generosity and of compassion and of going above and beyond what justice calls for. And it may be motivated out of a sense of compassion, but it's not really going to accomplish that in the long run. And ultimately, it's going to lie about the nature of the gospel and the nature of the grace of God in the gospel.
We have a lot more questions coming through, so let's move through some of these.
Yeah, let's try to do it quickly.
Dan asks, why give the topic any light? And I assume he's talking about social justice.
I'm not sure. Does he mean maybe, it's such a stupid topic that maybe we should even talk about it? In a sense, I would almost agree with him, except for the fact that there are thousands of, if not millions, of Christians who are being taken in by this stupid topic, who are falling victim to the false accusations of those who are peddling the stupid topic. And I think it's incumbent on us as Christian leaders, to whatever extent that we are Christian leaders, and every one of us is a leader in the church to some extent or another. It's incumbent upon us to speak the truth, to correct lies, to shine light into darkness, even if it's dark, stupid ideologies. So that'd be my answer. apart from more clarification on that.
All right, here's a question from Daniel. He says, of course, the Bible teaches social justice as opposed to social injustice. The question is how you're defining justice and what sorts of instances you include under the word justice. In philosophy of language, it's the distinction between intention, parentheses definition, and extension. What sorts of things are included in it? Giving to the poor is justice in a social context. Calling a male a woman because he wears a dress is an instance of biblical injustice. The presuppositionalist would rightly say that we need to let the Bible define what justice means, but you don't need to be a presuppositionalist in order to know this. You just have to believe that the Bible is true. I believe the Bible is true, and I'm not a presuppositionalist. All right, so there's a lot in there, but Jacob, I think we generally agree with him. There's one thing about justice. I think that maybe he wrote this before you commented about why it's so important. Anything you want to add?
No, I don't think there's anything to add to that. It was a good comment overall. Go ahead if you got more questions.
Another one from Todd. Where does the Bible tell us to change the circumstances of others? Does it not call us to have faith in God, faith that God is with us and through our troubles?
Yes, it's true that the Bible does call us to be content with whatever situation we find ourselves in, but I don't think that's a sufficient answer to the topic of social justice, because it also calls us to be salt and light in the world. It calls us to do good wherever it's possible, as far as we're able, as far as it depends on us, to be at peace with all men, to picture forth the grace of God in the gospel. So I don't think that a sufficient answer to social justice is let's just not focus on cultural issues, or let's not focus on political issues, or let's just focus on the gospel and forget about everything else. I think that's one thing that the advocates of social justice in the church have right, that even though social justice isn't a part of the gospel has implications for social justice, rightly defined, right? There are implications for what justice means in society. There are implications for what it means to be salt and light to the world from the Christian worldview, and we need to figure out what those are. The problem is not that these guys want to focus on what are the Christian implications for interacting with people in the world. The problem is that they get those implications wrong. They're misapplying theology to these issues of justice and charity and things like that. And because they're misapplying theology to those issues, they are ultimately lying about Christian theology in those issues. When you misapply theology, you confuse and send a bad message about the theology being applied. And so when people start to look at that application, they're going to get the wrong message about the theology. And so you end up communicating a false gospel.
Here's a comment from Matt, and he's going into the substance of the issue of whether it is just to do certain things by government force. And I think that he points out that strategically, there's a certain thing we need to know about here. He says, also, Thomas Sowell's books are a good antidote to anyone thinking that transfer payments are a help to minorities. The evidence shows that socialism kills blacks. Our argument should bang this drum. Comments there?
Yeah, I completely agree. This reminds me that I've been told, I won't say by who, but by Christian pastors, that they've been discouraged from posting quotes of Thomas Sowell because it can be offensive to blacks, right? So the idea is that the black identity is wrapped up in a certain ideology, and Thomas Sowell, even though he's a black man and a very, very educated black scholar, he opposes that ideology, and therefore he's opposing blackness, and therefore to post his quotes even on Twitter can be seen as offensive to blacks and potentially racist. Now that's really disturbing, and obviously Matt would agree with us on the fact that that's disturbing, but it's important for us to see that that's a phenomenon that's going on, and that's one of the reasons why it's important for us to be fighting this battle, because that's just such an absurd line of thinking, that that people would have emotional reactions and then use those emotional reactions to silence arguments and ideas is really, really concerning, and it ought to concern us as Christians. Yes, I think that's right. I think we absolutely should be pointing out the fact that socialism and the socialistic type policies that are often being advocated for, whether implicitly or explicitly, are the enemies of minorities, whatever the case may be, whether it's blacks or Latinos or whoever else.
Jacob, let's talk a second let's talk about objectivity. Something that you're saying here reminds me of the principle that we need to know what's true, and truth is not our enemy. And I think that what's happened here with critical race theory and in general critical epistemology, critical theory, postmodern approaches that reject objectivity, what they are saying is that some facts are not friendly to our group. What does that say about their outlook?
Yeah, I think it's indicative that not only the culture but the church has dove headlong into a sort of tribalism that is deeply problematic. The common trend in the culture and in the church is to talk about feelings and narratives and impressions and what's the word? Optics, right? Way before questions of truth get raised, way before we want to interact with facts. And I think that's a really big problem, because in the Bible and throughout Christian history, the tradition has been that facts come first, the truth comes first, and you determine what's right or wrong regarding social interaction, regarding the feelings of other people, based on the facts, right? So if someone is offended by something, the first thing to do is not to say, all right, well, let's get rid of that thing. The first thing to do is to say, well, should they have been offended by that? Were they offended by it because it's false and evil? And then we should side with them in their offense in fighting that thing? Or were they offended because it's true? In which case we should side against them and maybe pastorally help them to get over their offense of the truth, but to nevertheless hold on to the truth. And we've lost the ability to make that type of distinction. The common mindset in the church and in the culture today is that truth doesn't matter, and probably because a lot of people deep down believe that you can't get to the truth of these things. A lot of people believe that we just can't access the truth on these things. We're incapable of it for whatever reasons, whether it's some form of fideism, whether it's some form of postmodernism, whether it's some form of Kantianism, which I think all those three have similar roots. Whatever it is, there's the predominant idea that truth either is inaccessible or irrelevant, and all that matters, therefore, is our individual or group perspectives on things and how we react to other people's perspectives in a quote-unquote loving manner.
All right, let's wrap up our Facebook Live discussion with this question from Adam. He asks, is the word social ever a helpful qualifier to denote a subset of issues of justice? And another way of asking that is, what issues might legitimately qualify as social aspects of justice?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, in one sense, social refers to interpersonal interactions, right? And justice is typically already talking about interpersonal interactions. It's talking about giving someone their due. So already assumed in the concept of justice is typically at least two persons, one giving to the other their due. And so it seems like justice is sort of already inherently social in a certain respect. Now, perhaps you could make the argument that by social you mean large-scale interpersonal interactions. So rather than just one-to-one individual, maybe you mean, whole groups interacting with each other, or large numbers of individuals interacting with each other on a grand scale through certain social institutions like government, like the family, like the church. So perhaps that's that's one legitimate way to use the qualifier social in regard to justice. But the important thing to notice is that using the qualifier social, if you're going to use it in that way, doesn't change the meaning of justice. It doesn't change the essential nature of what justice means. It simply narrows the focus of justice in a particular context, namely in the context of those social institutions that you want to refer to, if that's what you're going to use it.
Yeah, I like that sometimes I hear you saying justice in a social context. And I think that just differentiates between, it would be unjust of me to not be thankful for my parents in their role in raising me. That's personal justice, but the law has nothing to do with that. And that really doesn't shine on society on the whole. Mm-hmm. So it's neither one of those things. It's just interpersonal. And that's, so if you say social justice, you're saying it's not that.
Sure, and it's helpful to realize that if we're going to use social justice in that way, to refer to justice in a social context, that there's still a further distinction that can be made between justice in a social context that involves the government and justice in a social context which doesn't involve the government, right? So one example of justice in a social context which doesn't involve the government might be the church sort of collectively advocating for a moral view in society that implies justice in the government, but doesn't immediately advocate for a law, right? So we might say the church ought to recognize that that capitalism is the moral ideal, and ought to advocate for free markets. But that's different from saying that the government should step in and forcefully implement that policy. Does that make sense? I'm kind of tripping over my words here.
I understand. The church has a role in educating people about what justice is. And that's actually an act of righteousness, to educate people about justice.
Yeah, and being prophetic to the state, I think, is the way that a lot of people would put it. That the church has a role in being prophetic and saying what should be, what is the proper role of government. But that it's not the same thing as the government then therefore writing laws based on the fact that the church says it, simply because the church says it. So in that sense, I'm kind of making the distinction between theonomy and in our view of politics there.
Yeah. Something that's worth saying is that theonomy is not my political view. I don't think it's yours, Jacob, but no. We have good friends that are theonomists. But it's, we would advocate Ayn Rand's political theory.
Yeah, which really could just be called laissez-faire capitalism, but that's sort of a whole nother can of worms to get into. And I think we're about ready to end our Facebook Live. So were there any other questions you wanted to wrap up with before we move on to our patron hangout?
Well, here's a closing thought from Greg that I think puts a bow on it. If we really want to help minorities and the poor, then we should be promoting capitalism.
Yes, absolutely. However, don't call that justice. So helping minorities and the poor is important, and it's something that Christians are called to do, and that's one reason that we should support capitalism. But it's not the main reason. The main reason we should support capitalism is because that's what justice demands. When you get into what justice is, it's giving people their due, and that's the system of capitalism. Capitalism means people having a right to their own private property, meaning having their due and giving people their due in economic transactions. That's the whole point of capitalism. It just so happens that also is the best way to help the poor and the needy.
All right. Thank you, Jacob, for doing this Facebook Live. And if you would like to find more access to Jacob's thoughts and my thoughts, you can find us at patreon.com/FTNCI. And our patrons get extra access to a prolonged Q&A period after this. Thank you, guys. We'll talk to you soon. So, Jacob, where would you like to go from here? And anybody else, go ahead and raise your hand or start talking.
Yeah, I'd like to open it up to you guys. I know that there was some interaction in the chat here. So if we didn't get to something that you wanted to get to, please just pop in and let's just start tackling the questions that you guys had.
Could I? There was one Bible verse that I mentioned. Actually, it was technically 3 Bible verses, but I kind of want to get your guys' take on this, if that's all right. Because I think it's directly relevant to everything.
Go ahead, yeah.
So it's from Exodus 23, and it's the first 3 verses. Normally, I don't use the NIV because I think it's usually kind of watered down, but I thought it was more to the point than other translations were. It says, "Do not spread false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd. And do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit." And I looked at that, and part of my take on it, because I know it's more of me giving my opinion than a question at first, but I want to get your take also. When I see this last part of "do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit," a lot of times in our culture that really translates to showing favoritism to somebody based on their race. Like we were talking before about the case of Michael Brown from Hands Up, Don't Shoot fame, where it was like, hey, this police officer was proven innocent. We know he was innocent. Even Barack Obama and Eric Holder acknowledged he was innocent. But there were still a lot of people basically saying, this police officer should be in jail, purely because of their feelings towards him because he was a white police officer, and for no other reason. So I really think this last part, not just the poor, but also don't show favoritism to a particular ethnic minority or majority based solely on the color of their skin, is very relevant in today's interactions about social justice.
Yeah, I think there's a really severe and surprising confusion that goes on when a number of Christian pastors and leaders today read those passages in the Old Testament. They see an emphasis on the poor and the suffering and the needy, and then talk of justice, and they automatically infer that justice always and only consists of deferring to the poor, the suffering, and the needy, or the minority. And I don't know how they make that logical leap. I mean, they're careful exegetes when it comes to theology, but when it comes to culture and politics and social interaction, they just completely lose their minds, it seems like, and go completely off board and make all these wild assumptions that there's no reason to draw that conclusion from those passages. It's much better to read those passages and say, it looks like typically the poor, the needy, the sojourner, or the minority in society is the victim of injustice, and that's why there's an emphasis on those people in those passages that are calling for justice, right? So but the point is justice. Justice is what God's concerned about in those passages, and it just so happens that those people, that those demographics, are the ones who are the major victims of injustice, and that's why God's calling attention to them. But it doesn't necessarily follow that those people will always be the victims of injustice, or that when someone in that group claims an injustice has taken place, that therefore an injustice has necessarily taken place. That's just absurd. In fact, I think there's a really good argument to be made that in our contemporary society, it's far more likely that someone outside of those groups is actually going to be the victim of an injustice. It's far more likely that the rich are victims of injustice today than that the poor are victims of injustice today.
With one important exception is the public school system.
Yes, I agree. So depending on what we're talking about, but if we're talking about regulations, laws, equal weights and measures, that type of thing, then I think it's far more likely that the rich are victims of injustice than the poor are. If we're talking about widespread social systems like the public school system, like welfare, there's a certain sense in which both are victims. But I think there's an important sense in which the victimization of the rich goes completely ignored. Nobody cares about the fact that the rich are victimized in the welfare system. Well, notice even libertarians and people on the hard right who will explicitly advocate for getting rid of the welfare system, and there aren't many of them, notice that they always appeal to the plight of the poor under welfare, which is true. The poor do suffer from welfare, but they never appeal to the injustice against the rich in the welfare system. And that in itself is an injustice, right? And that's the type of injustice that I was trying to think of when I was talking about what the church should draw attention to. There's an injustice in the fact that no one cares about the injustice of the rich because they're rich, because they think, oh, well, that doesn't matter. So there's this idea that justice only pertains to those who are suffering, and suffering only pertains to those who are really, really, really suffering in comparison to other people in society, which is just completely absurd. So, and this falls into that whole need-based theory of justice, which I think falls into the whole idea of altruism, and true suffering is only an issue of comparison, where you're really, really on the bottom in comparison to other people.
To give just a little bit of pushback and not to take up too much of my time, and I'm giving a little pushback just because I know some people will be first-time viewers for this video, and I don't want them to misunderstand. So, I mean, you talked about, the rich being more likely to suffer injustice than the poor. If I go to a poor community, like there's an area in this city where I used to live that's very impoverished. When I lived there in 2015, it was quite terrible, and it's actually a night and day difference right now. But prostitutes, drugs, like any type of awfulness, you name it. Somebody walking through that neighborhood, I could easily see them getting mugged. There's a lot of problems there, versus, the rich. One of the big injustices they'll have is having their taxes taken away, yet they have plenty of money to spare. I mean, they're not going to starve to death if they make $1 million a year and they have half their taxes taken away. Again, I think like you, but I'm just giving some pushback here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would want to comment on that, Greg. So
go ahead, Cody.
There are people that work really, really hard to create jobs for other people, and they have to endure not only 80-hour work weeks to make their dream and everybody else's dream come true, but a certain amount of stress on their psyche, knowing that if they succeed, they're going to have to pay about 50% of their profits to taxes. And if they fail, they're going to go bankrupt. So there's no backup plan. A friend of ours has a coffee shop, and he's telling me about just how prohibitive it is to bring even a single extra employee on board. And so the thing is, it's massively unjust when one of those employees shows up and cracks a joke that says, we don't have any customers today, so I guess I'll just go home early, but you can still pay me. No, that employee, if there's no work to do, they ought to be sweeping the floors or standing on the corner bringing people in or doing something, because they're getting paid. And so the guy that owns this coffee shop, he is saying to himself on the inside, like, oh my gosh, I am making a way for you to have a living, and this is how you treat me. This is so unjust. Or I'm just going to call in sick. I'm going to call in sick, and you're going to still have to pay me. That approach is just reprehensible. And, I've seen this with my own wife. She works as a high up in a company, and it's a deep personal sacrifice that I'm making and she's making in order for other people to have a living. And, we take it for granted that there are going to be businesses. There are going to be jobs. Who makes those jobs?
Yeah. And then in addition to that, as Adam pointed out, to turn around and call the employer a wicked fat cat capitalist, right? That how dare they be concerned about their profits? And then to to claim that that's justice, that justice is fighting those people, the people who are working hard to try to provide a living. It's so horribly backwards. And this is something that hardly anybody, especially in the church, wants to talk about. And I think it's really imperative that we start talking about it, because I think people are looking for something to care about, something to have moral outrage towards, and rightfully so, because the country's going down the drain. The world's going down the drain in a lot of ways. There is a lot of suffering in the world. There's a lot wrong with the world, and they're looking for what to blame. And that's not a bad thing, because it's appropriate to want to blame something when things are going bad. The problem is they don't know what to blame. And we who know what is truly to blame need to express that moral outrage and encourage others to do likewise. It's appropriate to be upset at people who want to tear down capitalism and to say, no, that's horribly unjust. The moral outrage that's currently being targeted at capitalists is the moral outrage that should be targeted by capitalists against everybody who's against capitalism, with the same level of moral righteousness, with the same sense of taking the moral high ground. And that's exactly what we need to be doing.
Gotta throw one more thing out on this train of thought before letting somebody else ask a question.
Yep.
All right. There's been times in my life, since graduating from high school, I've been in college in and out, and I finally graduated from college in 2015, and it took a long time. I didn't have a lot of money. My parents didn't have a lot of money to send me to college, but I managed to get through it. But there's been times where I've had no job. I've gone a year at a time where I couldn't find work. Like, I couldn't even get a job at McDonald's. And now I'm looking around these days with whatever we think about Donald Trump's tweets or his philosophy about the world. It's like we're seeing a lot less restrictions on the free market than we were before. And as a result, there's plenty of jobs out there. I think the unemployment rate last I heard was 4%. So there's actually more jobs out there than the number of people looking for work. And for me, I actually went downtown to the welfare office, and I was sitting there, all these people in there, and I'm just like looking around. I'm like, this is awful, because for every $100 I'm getting, from, food stamps or whatever other program that they were trying to put me on, and then I didn't even get the programs that I was entitled to, that I had paid to be able to be on. That was annoying, because it's like it was a full-time job just doing all their paperwork. And I didn't even get everything that I had paid the government to have as a safety net. So I didn't even get my safety net. But I looked around, I'm like, wait a minute. For every $100 that I'm getting, or this other guy is getting, this is $100 being taken out of the pocket of an employer. And an employer could be a consumer. It could be somebody who is going to go buy a $5 coffee at Starbucks. It could be somebody who's going to go buy a sandwich at McDonald's. Or it could be somebody who wants to buy more medicine, for going into my field, and getting, so maybe they're buying a pharmaceutical that they need for their body or for their kids, and that's creating a research job for me. And now, thank God, I'm finally in a research lab, and I'm doing very well for myself. I'm very happy about it. But I looked around at the whole thing, the whole welfare thing. I'm like, okay, you are destroying the ability of somebody to have a job. Like, at the very, very least, maybe, like, I've heard the phrase workfare before. At the very, very least, this money could have been used to pay these people to go get some job experience. And I would say even that's unjust based on what I've kind of learned from you and Cody. But the whole thing was just a total mess. And it's like the welfare thing was not helping the poor. It was just taking money away from employers and paying people to sit on their butts all day, when that's not what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be out there making money and making the world a better place. So I guess that's my 2 cents on it. Hope I didn't go on too long.
Yeah, and to put it in big picture and see the full injustice of it, wealth is produced by the productive energy and focus of individual humans, right? So wealth is an extension of someone's life, and all of that wealth is the extension of productive people's lives, and it's being thrown away and consumed into the black hole of people who want to sit on their couch. And so essentially what it is, if you really boil it down, it's like a rubber tube draining blood from people who are able and productive and pumping it into people who don't care about their lives, who don't want to lift a finger to do what they need to do to make a living for themselves. And that's just a really, really disgusting, evil picture. And that's a picture that we need to paint over and over and over again until people get the point.
No, one more thing. Sorry. I know I said one more thing last time, but in the overregulation, you'll see, especially in Democrat-run communities, and this is a big part of what happened in Detroit. It's what's happens in a lot of inner cities. You'll have places that are run by Democrats. They put all these overregulations on businesses. So even without the high taxes, you have overregulated businesses. Therefore, businesses are driven away. And some of these are regulations that don't make any sense. They're like, if you're, they'll have to do with like racial demographics within a business and all that stuff. Therefore, these businesses are driven out into the suburbs. So you'll have it where a lot of these, not just the overregulation, but you have the overregulation, the taxes, all of this stuff. It drives business away, and it basically forces people to be in a situation where they're forced. So even if you're not somebody who wants to sit on a couch, sometimes that's all that happens because of what the government forced to happen. And then sadly, you have these rundown public schools, especially in ghetto communities, and you have, I guess I don't have to apologize for being partisan. You have Democrats forcing people into bad schools and opposing school choice. You have overregulations of businesses. You have high taxes. So the communities run into the ground, and then people say, oh, capitalism isn't working. It's that rich guy's fault because he won't give us some of his money. Therefore, let's go vote Democrat and get welfare. And it's such a sick, vicious cycle of salting the earth so that nothing can grow.
Yeah, it's important to ask why does that pass as justice when it's obviously unjust? And the answer, I think, is because people have an attitude that is geared, one, towards feelings over facts, and two, towards suffering over production. And those are tied to some of the main things that we are wanting to combat at FTNCI, which is facts over feelings, reason as a means of knowledge rather than emotions or whims or faith or whatever the case is, and then rational self-interest, value production over suffering and victimhood, which is over against altruism, right? So that's sort of the combination that we need to correct these social ills in the big picture. Does somebody else have a question that they wanted to touch on along those lines or anything else?
Jacob, I would add on the foundation that you just described, there's also the potential to have individualism and individual rights as opposed to collectivism and group rights. And something that I was thinking when Greg was sharing about that is the total injustice of isolating a group of people based on some demographic fact, such as race or gender or anything else, or and treating them differently under the law or treating them differently as far as giving them handouts. If you wanted to take a group of people and isolate them and make them disliked and over time statistically incentivize them to bad behavior so that as a population they would achieve less than every other population, what would you do? What could you do that would be more effective toward that end than to subsidize bad behavior? Than to subsidize irresponsibility. And that wouldn't matter what race you chose or what group you chose. Long term, you get more of what you subsidize. And so that's why I think that handouts are an injustice. They are an injustice to everyone, the people that are being bled dry and the people that are sitting on their couches.
Yep, absolutely. Matt, you're unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to ask or just say?
Oh, there's a lot there.
Jump in wherever you
want.
want.
First of all, I would defend y'all's position against anybody who would say, like, how dare you defend the rich because, they live cushy lives or something along those lines. And a lot of times I think it's important to remember that most people think that everybody that owns a business is extremely wealthy. And that's not the reality most of the time.
But even if it was, who cares?
Well, yeah, who cares? But at the same time, like these people that are
Yes.
paying like 50% in taxes aren't like, they don't have big mansions and stuff. That's not exactly what's going on. And my parents ran a business for most of my life, restaurant. And just to see the stress and the crap that comes along with it, and it's not just taxes. There's a lot of stuff in the legal system that makes it very difficult for them to operate in general. It makes it just I honestly I don't think I'll ever have a company with employees because it's just such a disaster. But beyond that, I guess going off to another subject or just some thoughts that I had while listening to you earlier during the Facebook live stream. One thing that came to mind that I've thought about over the last few years is the left and even Christian social justice advocates, their tendency to put racism on a pedestal as if it's worse than like anything you could think of, like pedophilia or murder or whatever. Just the way they talk about it and how they advocate against it, you would think that it's by any means we have to stop this. But then at the same time, how they'll throw out accusations of racism in the name of their social justice cause, as if they're meaningless, and how those are two completely contradictory understandings of it, that it's okay to throw out these random accusations while at the same time it's the worst thing that could ever happen, right? Is for somebody to have a racist view or to write, or for like the instance, that guy Kyle the other day said the what's her name, Serena Williams cartoon was racist, and like to pretend like that's the worst thing that can happen is racism, but then like throw out accusations where somebody's intent is not even close to racism. So I was just wondering like kind of what your thoughts are on that. Like, am I right in that assessment that they view it as worse than murder? And anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I'm actually writing an article on this right now. I don't know that I would say they view it as worse than murder, but they do certainly view it as deserving extreme moral outrage. And there's a certain sense in which they're right? Mm-hmm. And everyone else agrees that racism properly understood, and that's the important qualifier, that racism properly understood, or what we might call true racism, does deserve extreme moral outrage. But what they've done is they've changed or expanded the definition of racism to be so all-inclusive that now, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to equivocate. And I think a lot of people are doing this intentionally. Some people maybe not fully intentionally, but it's still a phenomenon. What happens is you use the restricted definition in order to get the extreme moral outrage. So you get the extreme moral outrage because everybody's operating off of that restricted definition, that classical definition of what true racism is. And that's why it generates the extreme moral outrage. And they're relying on that, but then trying to widen it as far as possible so that they can aim that extreme moral outrage at things that don't actually deserve it. Yeah. And that's where the equivocation is.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. And that's exactly what I was thinking. I was wondering if you were looking along the same lines. That they just constantly bring up actual issues of racism and then align them with something that's not at all racist in order to get people just to agree with them and to cower down, basically. I've been in many instances where I've had that personally happen to me. Somebody takes something that could never in any way be perceived as racist and throws that at you, and it's to a point like where I couldn't figure out how to handle it at first. Like there were times when I'd get pissed and I'd just tell them things that I shouldn't say. But and then there are times whenever I just laugh because I can't even fathom how people get to these conclusions. And I'm not talking about like random guy on Facebook, like people write to my face will say stuff. And it's because of that. It's because they elevate it and then they equivocate everything to it, and they're doing it with the purpose. Like there has to be some purpose, even if they're ignorant.
Yeah. Dude. Yes. And I think it's really, really essential to fight back against that and not allow them to get away with that. And I'm not going to prescribe the exact way to go about doing that, but it's really essential that we learn not to let people get away with that, because it's a really deceptive and slanderous attack. And they're doing it with an agenda, like you said, which means that it's used in order to introduce something that wouldn't be introduced and accepted otherwise. Go ahead, Cody, real fast, and then Greg.
Yeah, there's a name for that kind of fallacious way of arguing, and it's called the Mott and Bailey fallacy, which is, if you look it up, you'll say, oh, wow, this is the main mode of operation of most leftists most of the time. And it refers to, in the days where there were forts and castles, they would have, say, on a hill, they'd have their town, but then there'd be a little extra high part of the hill where they'd build their most fortified defenses. And so the point being that they have their town, kind of like in Lord of the Rings, the second one, you know, that town in the middle of the plain. I forget what it's called, like the Rohan or something like that. But so then if they were under attack, they'd have an outer wall, but then they could retreat to the inner walls higher up as well. And the point being that you can switch back and forth that's great. That's great if you're trying to defend your position. But what they do in the logic, in an argument setting, the Mott and Bailey fallacy is, you know, when you present one thing as obvious, and then you move to that other place, you know, I don't know. So you switch back and forth, you equivocate, and you switch your position or what you mean by the words, depending on whether you're trying to bring people in and say, pay attention to me, this is legitimate, versus when somebody says, well, define your terms, then you're gonna equivocate to the position that's easier to defend.
Yeah,
I've seen that. Without getting, I know it would be way too long for me to go into detail with it, but I see that a lot when, as somebody with a science background, when I used to believe in evolution, and I see that a lot when people are trying to defend that, where they're switching back and forth between different definitions of evolution. But with regards to racism, Cody, you may have just kind of answered this, but I really wonder, how much do people really believe this? Like I've been accused of, I think anybody whose skin is as white as, you know, mine or yours or Matt's, if we had a nickel for every time we've been called a racist or a white supremacist, we'd have quite a few nickels. Do these people really believe this? Like, is this really a case of, oh, well, you oppose Black Lives Matter or whatever, therefore you're a racist, or, oh, you oppose welfare, therefore you're a racist. And of course, we're seeing this in the church, and it amazes me because, you know, even in the last election, you know, we saw quite a pushback against, you know, this leftism, and, you know, people don't like it. People are saying, you know what? No, I don't like this fundamental leftism. Like it's crazy. It's people don't like it. And yet now so many people in the church are trying to adopt it so they can win a popularity contest. But how much do people really believe this? How much do people really actually think, oh, well, you Cody, oppose welfare, and of course I oppose welfare. We all do here, I think. Therefore you hate Black people. Do people really, really believe this, or is it just them being angry? Or is it a combination?
I don't think we need to worry about whether or not they believe it, because we don't need to be in the business of reading people's minds or intentions. I think what's more important is establishing there's a difference between the racism that everybody agrees deserves extreme moral outrage and what you're accusing me of. There's a very important difference between those two things, and you are failing to make that difference, and in doing so, you are basically slandering me. You are calling down extreme moral outrage upon me for something that I have not done or engaged in by equivocating on this term. And you likely know that you're doing it, and you need to stop it now. That's the essential thing that we need to communicate and not let them get away with.
Do you think this is the case other places as well, Jacob? Because it seems like what you just said is very important. It's, you know, far, far more important even beyond just this issue of not trying to read people's minds and just recognizing that what this person said is factually untrue, or what this person said about me is untrue of my character.
Yeah, I think that's true in general. I mean, you see this trend not just with race, but not with sexism. The whole Brett Kavanaugh stuff. It's a very similar phenomenon of unwarranted accusations with very little to back it up, and the idea is you're supposed to kowtow and then come to the bargaining table, they might say, in order to alleviate the accusation, rather than just say, no, this is not true. And I think that's a mistake that many conservatives in general make, is trying to bargain their way out of the accusation rather than saying, no, you're lying, shut up, stop it, you're being evil, and I'm not going to stand for that, which is what we need to be doing. Go ahead, Cody.
Well, to answer your question, Greg, so when you're combating a false accusation, do what Jacob said. But when you're trying to understand other people's motivations and you're thinking about it for yourself, sure, you can think about other people's motivations. That's probably a smart thing to do. And something to consider is the bandwagon effect, where let's say, so I'll tell you a quick account of something that happened on a college campus recently that I was told about. This is a very liberal college campus, and one of the lead administrators, who happens to be a black man, stood in a meeting of all the other administrators, and he said, this social justice thing has got out of hand. All of our students are insane. We just need to nip this thing in the bud. And all of a sudden, every one of these liberals were like, yeah, you know what, social justice, it's kind of dumb, because it's like the emperor's new clothes type fallacy, where nobody wants to be the one that goes first. And so I've been in a situation where I've been in a room of people where I've said, hey, here's what I believe. And every one of them has thought to themselves, I've seen it on their faces, every one of them has thought to themselves, we can't let him say that because somebody might mistake him for what he means. So that's the bandwagon and sheep type fallacy, where you're more concerned about social metaphysics. You're more concerned about what everybody else thinks about what was said versus whether it was actually true. Mm-hmm. Be aware that that is a psychological phenomenon, and try to head off those objections so that they don't ever come up in the first place. Put people in the best position so that they don't have to confront that fallacy of their own. But be aware, and especially if you're talking to a group of people where they are conscious of each other's thoughts, that's going to happen to you.
Yeah. We've got to go here soon, so let's try to wrap it up and see. Matt and Adam, do you guys have anything else that you'd like to ask or comment on?
I guess y'all are just speaking about how y'all have spoken up a couple of times in like a church setting. So I would wonder, what would be your recommendation for dealing with this sort of thing within the context of the church, like people throwing out.
So I'm sorry, I think you might have froze up there. Are you still there, Matt? Matt? That's unfortunate. I'll just kind of answer in general until he comes back, because I'm sure he has something more specific in mind. But if you notice a general trend of just people in the church, and especially pastors in the church, accusing people of being racist, when it seems pretty clear that they're not, or just false accusations in general, I think it's really important to bring it up to the eldership, to write them an email or ask them to meet with you and say, hey, I think there's probably a genuine confusion going on here, but whether it's but in virtue of a confusion or in virtue of being intentional, this is really problematic and really dangerous, and here's why. Matt's back, it looks like. Matt, do you want to clarify? You cut out after asking how we would advise dealing with this in a church, and then you cut out. So did you have something more specific about your question there?
I mean, that was pretty much the sum of it, but just in context of like, I mean, you see a lot of leaders in these movements that have a lot of influence, like even like some really well-known pastors like Matt Chandler and then some less well-known people like Kyle J. Howard and Tabiti, people that are just known within the circles and people that are known by the entire world. I was just wondering, like, how do you think that should even be dealt with? Because I don't even know where we begin besides speaking out. But it seems like that to a certain extent then it's just online, this person saying this, and then other people, saying other things, and it just seems kind of pointless. Like, is there something more effective, or is it just there's not enough people speaking out yet?
Well, like I said, I'm writing an article on this right now, and
sense?
I think the article I'm writing on this right now will be very effective in helping people, especially pastors, think through this issue. And so sharing that potentially with your pastors might be helpful. It might also be helpful to meet with them, especially if you see them liking or sharing things from people like Howard or Tabiti or Chandler or whatever on this topic. Sit down and meet with them and say, hey, I think there's a serious danger here, and here's why. And here's the confusion that I think these people are making, or that you might be making. And try to be humble about it, but be firm and resolute as well, because it's a serious issue that deserves firmness and resoluteness. So I would say talk to them about it. Talk to as many people as you can about it. If you have people in your church who seem to be advocating this idea, ask them to meet with you for coffee. If you got people in your church that are upset with you posting about this type of stuff on social media, do the same. Ask them to meet with you for coffee, have a discussion, and say, look, I think this is serious. I don't see this as a mere political debate. I see this as a really serious issue. I think justice is on the line here. And you care about justice a lot. I care about justice a lot. Let's talk about what really is justice. One of us is right and one of us is wrong, and we've got to figure this out. Challenge them to, call their bluff. If they really care about justice, then they're going to want to sit down with you and talk about it and hash it out. If they don't, then they're lying when they talk about it online. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, just thinking about the pastoral care for a brother. I think Cody mentioned, he used the language pastoral concern for people. And thinking about that with relation to social media and just the whole, I don't know, there's a way of dialoguing online that just seems so radically alien to pastoral care. And not that we owe everybody online pastoral care as brothers when we don't even know who most of them are, But just wondering about some general guidelines that you'd have for caring about people's hearts in these conversations, in a pastoral, brotherly sense. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
I think it's important to remember that we are talking to people,
Yeah.
and that the people with whom we're speaking, or about whom we're speaking sometimes, may not be as guilty as we think they are of intentional obfuscation or of intentional evil. They may be victims of some pretty serious confusions themselves, and that helps in the way that you position things and the tone that you have when you respond to people.
Yeah.
I think the more someone is involved in professionally dealing with ideas, the less they deserve that benefit of the doubt.
Sure.
Because it's their job to work through confusions like that. So, for instance, with Russell Moore, Tabiti, but especially with Russell Moore, because his job is culture and politics, right? So with someone like that, I don't think he deserves as much benefit of the doubt as some random person who happens to follow him online. Russell Moore likely knows better when he's making these claims that confuses different types of racism. Someone who's following him may not. They may not have thought through it very carefully. And so, you can have a little bit more of a quote unquote charitable attitude towards, a non-intellectual or a non-church leader than you would to a church leader. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I like the idea of making it clear to people that you don't owe them your time. Like Cody, you're really good at that online. People
Yeah.
would take all of your time if you gave it to them. And some people do that, and they'll sacrifice their family life and, live on their keyboard to maintain these arguments. And when it's not helping them or you or anybody. So I appreciate the way that you kind of have this real laser focus and stay on topic, but don't necessarily give everybody all the time that they would want or they'd presume upon.
I appreciate you saying that, Adam. Yeah, I've put a lot of thought into how to be a Christian on social media. I have a Facebook group called Learning How to Be a Christian on Social Media because I need it, and I need people that will remind me what it looks like. And yeah, if you go to codyleibolt.com, you'll see a good article. It's the first article there. It's about how to be wise, how to be an adult on social media. I think that one of the policies that has been helpful for me is try to come across as a good-natured person. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to shy away from correcting people, even my elders. And when somebody's being obtuse, I will say you're being obtuse. And the policy generally that I'm going for, big picture, is I'm trying to create a culture of expectations around the discussions taking place in my neck of the woods on social media. And so if I see that people are creating a bad culture or making my life quality decrease because of how annoying they are, I just block. And that's different from the way a lot of people do it. Jacob wants to position himself as a professional intellectual. And so if he were to do that, that would look bad for him. I want to position myself as a propagandist and a marketing expert for Jacob. So I don't mind if people think that I'm trash as far as my intellectual credentials. I don't care. I'm trying to generate leads. That's my goal, is to generate interest among people who have an affinity for my ideas. And if somebody obviously dislikes me personally, I will not stay connected to them on social media.
Yeah, so I think in general, it's a matter of clarifying your goals and your calling on social media, because I think if you're on it, you ought to be on it because you've got some sort of calling or connection to your calling, especially when you're dealing with ideas like this. And so it's a matter of identifying stewardship and calling when it comes to your time and your mental focus, and then being honest and try to be charitable when possible, but don't let charity or supposed charity become the enemy of the truth. Because I could, in the name of charity, give people like Russell Moore every benefit of the doubt, but I'm convinced that in doing so, I would be sacrificing the truth, and that in the long run isn't true charity. It's not true love. You've got to be able to think critically, as I know, Adam, you are perfectly capable of, and judge each person and situation accordingly to figure out, does this person deserve the benefit of the doubt on this issue? And if so, how do you communicate it and still challenge them to think a little bit more critically themselves? So. All right, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us today. Hopefully, we'll be able to have a similarly active one next month. We'll keep you guys posted. And we're going to try to be doing a little bit more regular podcasts in general. So stay tuned. If you see us go live on Facebook, make sure you share, like, comment, all that, and ask us questions there too, because we definitely will give you guys preferential treatment even there. So see you guys later. Have a good Saturday.